Hello and welcome to Conversations. I'm Jim Blow, your host. Very pleased to have joining me today, Eli Cooper, the Transportation Program Manager for the City of Ann Arbor, if I've got that right. But the key is you look at issues related to, you could say, future transportation, both needs and projects for the City of Ann Arbor.
That's correct. I describe it as everything that moves and some things that don't.
And trying to make it possible for them to move in some cases.
That's correct.
And so your focus is more on the future than the daily operations of what's going on this summer as far as roads and construction and that kind of stuff.
That's correct. My responsibility primarily is in the planning capacity, but please rest assured that our future plans are based on the way our system operates today.
Right. And with respect to Ann Arbor, when we talk about transportation, it's not just automobiles. You're looking at what types of modes of transportation?
So in Ann Arbor, we have a very multimodal transportation mix. We worry about and plan for everything from pedestrians, that includes sidewalks and crosswalks, bicyclists, bicycle lanes, cycle tracks, protected cycle areas, transit, that would include ATA, the ride, as well as Amtrak and potentially future RTA regional transit services in the community, and automobiles.
And you've been with the city working in this area for how long now?
Over 12 years. Time
Okay.
flies when you're having fun.
Right. And so you've seen changes and shifts in both the type of transportation that Ann Arbor, you could say, concentrates or focuses on, as well as looking to the future of what potentially will be needed in Ann Arbor.
One of the great opportunities that I've had when I started in 2005, we were embracing and adopting our first non-motorized transportation plan. We had a bicycle plan, but the 2005 to 2007 period, we took the bicycle plan and integrated that with the pedestrian plan, and had in 2007 the council adopted our first comprehensive non-motorized plan. Here's the significance of that. In the 2000 census, we had about 2.5% of the people rode bicycles to work based on self-reporting.
Okay, yeah.
Over the decade from 2005 to 2015, not only did we lose the census, we now have something called the American Community Survey, but we added about 80 miles of bicycle lanes. We now have about 5 to 5.5% of our commuters use bicycles to get to work, more than 2 times where we were before we had the plan and made the investments in our system. So what's happening is we're in that world of build it and they will come. We're adding bicycle lanes, we're listening to the community, and people are embracing it, and we see a lot more bicycle behavior in town today.
The non-motorized transportation, whether it be bicycle or do you also see an increase in walking? Is there a way of measuring that as far as whether it's going to work or doing more than just what might be considered recreational walking?
So one of the things that we have also embraced as part of our planning process is evaluation.
Yeah.
So we actually do take pedestrian and bicycle counts. There's no real counting that occurred, let's say, 15, 20, 30 years ago, but we have a regular database of counts. And although I would typically rely on the census information for how much of a certain behavior, what I would say is that our pedestrian activity is increasing based on our actual counts. We've counted the same location over time, and we're seeing increases. From time to time, if you do a count on a bad weather day, you'll actually see a decrease. But overall, with the type of land development, the growth that we're seeing in and around the downtown area and throughout the city, our data collection tells us not only are people bicycling more, we have more people walking and more people driving in the city.
Now, the non-motorized mode, I would assume you mentioned an increase in the bicycle lanes and making it, you could say, easier for people. In the case of pedestrian, is it predominantly sidewalks and other access to paths that don't put them in the middle of the road, so to speak?
Well, it's an excellent question. In the non-motorized plan, we both identified a series of sidewalk gaps, places where sidewalks were discontinuous, and you need to complete the sidewalk so you can go from one side of the block to, if you will, down the block. But it was also a key emphasis on pedestrians walking safely across a corridor, across the
Okay.
street. And the non-motorized plan called out about 130 new crosswalks. And over the past decade, we have not only added about 60 new crosswalks, but we've also installed new pedestrian actuated beacon type devices that make it more readily available, easier for a driver to understand when there's somebody who wants to walk across the street at that crosswalk.
Why would there not be a pedestrian crosswalk at every intersection?
So
Every time that, there's a person walking in a neighborhood comes to an intersection, they're going to cross.
So the fact is that crosswalks don't come cheaply. When you stop and think about it, a person can walk across a curb, but a person who has a mobility impairment can't. And there's the American with Disabilities Act, and so we would need, if we had painted crosswalks, to have curb ramps, and those cost a couple $1,000s on each side. And then you have the actual marking material. I would use the word paint, but paint, it's not. It's much more than paint. And so there are some policy documents to say that you should have crosswalks at every leg of every signalized crossing. We do on our major streets, but when we start getting into the secondary, the neighborhood streets, or where a neighborhood street would be walking alongside of a major, we might not provide a dedicated crosswalk in the way that would be recognizable to a driver or to a pedestrian.
And in your role as transportation manager, you're not getting into both the political and the discussion about pedestrian crosswalk and all the politics in Ann Arbor of when and in what case can someone have access. You're looking at it more of a mobility and moving people and traffic and that as safely as possible.
So I remember back when I started planning school, they described planning as the art and science. So there is a lot of science and data where we know where people are walking to and from, and that's where we do our observations. But there is a bit of a policy art to it. Under what circumstances, if you don't have any buildings here, but you have a border-to-border trail crossing, you can anticipate that there will be a need for a crosswalk. So I would shy away from the P word politics, but I would say as a planner, we do rely on both qualitative and quantitative indicators as to what it is that we prepare plans for.
You mentioned border to border, and in Washtenaw County and City of Ann Arbor specifically, there is an effort to provide non-motorized, ways, not just ways, but access throughout the city and ultimately throughout the county. That is obviously something that is an issue of planning and knowing both what Ann Arbor, you could say, wants, but also what the rest of the county is potentially going to provide. How far in advance does something like that, you could say, look, and where do we stand with the city compared to the county in making those plans now?
So again, history would be a better indicator of why we have, because within the City of Ann Arbor, the overwhelming majority of the border-to-border trail is complete, where when you look further out into the county sections, I know the county parks has just recently secured a millage, and they're continuing to complete what is referred to on the county-wide level, the border-to-border trail. I think that from the city standpoint, it dates back a few decades ago. Coordination with the Norfolk Southern Railroad, we have implemented the Gallup Park Trail, if you will, and parts of even the Argo Trail on the railroad right-of-way. So there was a fair amount of negotiations that went on in the day, and then the investments to create the connectivity, both for the purpose of the park users, because it is a beautiful trail. If folks haven't been on it, I'd encourage them to get out and enjoy it. It meanders along the river, meanders along the rail, which isn't quite as beautiful as the riverside of it, but in the world of parks, recreation, and transportation, this trail accommodates both transportation use as well as recreation use. And we are further ahead because of the amount of people within our community and the interest that we have both in access to parks and recreation within the community and also connecting to areas outside of the city.
In looking at planning for something like that, what are some of the limitations or what are some of the hurdles that I mean, why can't you just sort of put a curb cut in and, sort of connect the whole city?
Well, I think that anybody who's been watching the Allen Creek Greenway master planning process understands some of the hurdles that get in the way.
Right.
Where is it that the desire line is for the actual facility itself? Whose land is it on?
Okay.
Is it land that's available for the project? What are the intersections? The intersections both in the real world with vehicular traffic or other property owners, and the desire line. And is that desire line actually a feasible alternative, or is it something that you try to get as close to as you can? So there are any of a number of hurdles, and then ultimately some of what I experience when you have the master plan in place and you have a good idea of what you want to do, the hurdle of securing the resources in order to make the investment.
I say not only the resources, but also, as you imply, that it's not just all city land. I mean, you've got private ownership in some cases of property. You have the University of Michigan, the state of Michigan. You have the railroad that you've worked with over the years to get the right to build this right of way. Well, not the right of way, but the pathways or whatever. So it's more than just the money. It's also having the legal right to access it.
Oh, absolutely. And we use the term railroad, and I'll use this by way of an example. The rail with trail that we have, the border-to-border Gallup Park Trail, is with what's called a Class 1 railroad. That was Norfolk Southern. It's now owned by MDOT. They have a certain level of sophistication and legal support and insurance that enables them to work cooperatively on the other railroad corridor, the Ann Arbor Railroad that serves our community. That's recognized as a short line railroad. And that the ownership is a lot closer to the track on a short line, and the pockets aren't as deep to have the liability protections. So there are differences in one corridor versus the other, and those differences are significant.
Yeah, so is the city. We're going to take a short break, come back and look at some of the plans in both the border to border, but also look at the issue of transportation as far as the automobile and how Ann Arbor is addressing that. Ask our viewers to stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment.
Did you know that CTN welcomes the members of the Ann Arbor City Council to Ward Talk? On the third Wednesday of every month, a different representative from one of the city's 5 wards joins us in the studio to discuss matters important to the people and government of Ann Arbor. Submit your questions for the next episode of Ward Talk by emailing ctn@a2gov.org or visiting our Twitter page at CTN Ann Arbor.
Hello and welcome back to Conversations. I'm speaking today with Eli Cooper, the Transportation Program Manager for the City of Ann Arbor. Before the break, we were talking about the pedestrian and the non-motorized, and looking to the future, are there projects that you've begun working on related to movement of, you could say, people, that is, you could say, either exciting or maybe different, or people may not be aware of, and it's not just putting in new bicycle lanes or new sidewalks?
Well, I think one of the, I consider the most exciting projects I'm working on right now is going to change a century of transportation behavior.
Wow. Okay.
The Amtrak railroad corridor that runs parallel to Depot Street and alongside of North Main Street.
Dandy Dancer and going through there.
Right. It separates our downtown and downtown near neighborhoods from the Huron River and the waterfront recreational areas. And so we're currently working on a design project to build 2 tunnels underneath the railroad. We've got MDOT's authorization. We're in a design process. The 2 tunnels, one will be for a shared use path for bicyclists and pedestrians to get direct access to the riverfront. The other would be for stormwater. There's a primary flooding issue. Anyone who's been along Depot in the heavy rain knows that. And so there's going to be 2 separate openings. We're going to keep the water's going to follow the sign, water this way, people that way. But it's being designed in a way so that the railroad has been there since the late 1800s. And as long as the railroad's been there, it's been illegal for people to trespass across the railroad right of way. And so this is going to create a grade separated direct access from the downtown area, the Water Hill neighborhood, right to the Argo Dam, the Argo Cascades, and the border-to-border trail and the recreational opportunity that represents.
That type of project, as you say, you're beginning the design. How long does something like that take, both as far as planning, designing, before the implementation, assuming once again the money's there?
So I appreciate that question, and this is really a fast-track project.
Okay.
It was 2013 when the Federal Emergency Management Authority agency came to the city and asked whether we had a flood issue that we could address because there was some funding available. We started a feasibility study in 2013, primarily on the stormwater management.
I would say the flooding aspect as opposed to the pedestrian aspect.
So that was driving it, and as soon as we began to talk within the systems planning group that I work in, the stormwater manager was saying, I want to create an opportunity for water. I said, you're not going to do that without creating the opportunity for people. And we immediately put the non-motorized plan alongside of the stormwater, created the concept, went through a planning process, engaged the citizens in the 2013 timeframe, had a contractor work with us. We figured out whether we had enough vertical clearance between the water table and the bottom of the railroad. And it
you don't want to create a new water problem by digging under.
And so with that and some calculations on the size of the openings for flood water and eligibility for funding, the project was born. So we're sitting here now in 2017, 3-4 years later, in the design process. The design process itself, the council approved the contract for the engineers that are designing this project for us. And the expectation is that that design process will be about 9 months, and that by midsummer next year, we're actually going to be having a construction project underway. And that is, if you will, light speed. And light speed, I've still described
5 years almost.
5 to 6 years by the time the first human being, the first raindrops can go through these facilities once they're put in place.
So that deals with non-motorized. I mean, many in Ann Arbor still drive cars.
Yes.
And in looking to the future, are there plans or ideas being developed on how we might be able to move people within the city, either within the downtown or in and out of the different areas of the city by automobile more efficiently?
Well, there's been this hue and cry of efficiency, and there's another parallel key component, safety.
Right.
And many of the large metropolitan areas, Chicago, Seattle, have created what they call Vision Zero plans, where rather than trying just to move more traffic around, they're trying to move everyone around more safely. And I think we're in on both of those, safety and the mobility. The mobility is being broadcast as a piece of this autonomous or connected auto and infrastructure system, where the traffic signals actually communicate directly with the cars, the cars communicate with one another, and because they're all in constant contact with each other, they can reduce the amount of space between vehicles and allow for them to move more vehicles through the same space in the same amount of time, because there's less, and the additional benefit is because everything is connected and it has all sorts of sensing devices, that the sensing devices are sensitive enough to be able to discern the difference between a human being and a tree that might not be moving, and the vehicles
and
are
hopefully
programmed.
a bicycle or someone else in a non-motorized.
Correct. So that's going to both address the mobility needs moving forward within and out into the community, as well as create a better environment for the pedestrians and bicyclists within the city.
And somehow, whether it's through some form of GPS, you tell your car where it is you want to go. And then the autonomous can figure out the safest, fastest way of getting you from point A to point B.
And that,
ideally.
And that's the research that's being conducted right in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan's UMTRI, the Transportation Research Institute. We have some of the most advanced technology being deployed. The city is a partner, so there are linkages with our traffic signal systems with these vehicles, and that brings more interest from others. The auto manufacturers are now looking at Ann Arbor as a R&D center because we are furthest along and have an appropriate environment. You know, appropriate environment. People don't like driving in the snow, but if you're designing vehicles to sell, they're going to need to be able to manage
in the cold, and so the electronics has to be able to continue to operate when it gets sub-zero. And then if you want to go outside the city, as we were talking, will these autonomous vehicles be able to go from being, autonomous to going to Detroit and not necessarily having everything that is
Well, I'm not going to, it's interesting you say to Detroit to the east. What I'll focus on more right now, MDOT has got US 23 under construction, and they're putting an automated traffic management program on that facility, and it's going to have the similar, I don't want to say the same because a freeway system is not the same as an intersection in a city, but there will be the ability to have vehicle to infrastructure communication between the managed freeway lanes that they're going to have on 23 and the vehicles that will be designed in order to interact with that system.
So some anticipation of shifts or changes in how automobiles and people use highways.
Correct.
While this is going on.
And I think one of the, in urban planning circles, there's a lot of discussion on, will people live further away because they don't have to drive? I, for one, am really looking at the autonomous systems as a way to protect and preserve human life and people's safety.
And that's tied into the ability to sense and read, you say, what's ahead of you or what's beside you, and to avoid as much as possible, or eliminate, ideally, the accidents and that which cause loss of life or injury.
So whether it's radar or LiDAR, those systems won't be distracted by their cell phone ringing. And so we talk a lot about distracted driving or distracted walking when people are out on our transportation system. Autonomous systems will eliminate at least that variability.
And that's great for the future. But I'm still driving a car. I'm still trying to get from the northeast portion of Ann Arbor to downtown. And, in looking at, say, 3 to 5 years down the road, are, any major shifts or changes, or is it more just sort of maintaining what we have in Ann Arbor? More and more roads having more not limitations, but restricted movement with more bicycle lanes, so you go from 2 to 1 lane, but you have, turn and all that.
When you say 3 to 5, and we talked
Yeah.
about a little tunnel taking
Right,
5
yeah.
years to deliver, in that short term, I think what we can rely on is continued enhancements to technology. So we currently have smart sensing traffic signal control on roads like Fuller and Plymouth, and that to the degree that there are enhancements in technology that will enable even human-driven vehicles to more effectively use the space. We had been studying a local transit system called the Connector. Unfortunately, the cost estimates took the project out of the realm of feasible based on what we know today.
Right.
So there continues to be a look at, if we step up from what we have today, what would that step look like? Will there be a identified transit corridor, either using reserved lanes or maybe a transit way constructed adjacent to some of our existing streets? Because a bus can carry 50 to 65 people very effectively. And with technology on transit, you can even have buses coming closer together to mirror some of the capacity that we were looking for in a streetcar-based system. Those are things that we will continue to plan in the coming 3 to 5 years. And the expectation is that I hope, will come up with a strategy that we can actually implement in the years to follow.
One quick final question, only because it sort of popped in my mind. City of Ann Arbor, do we have any dedicated lanes to automobiles with more than 1 or 2 passengers?
So back in the
say along Fuller,
1970s, there was an experiment of arterial HOV.
Okay, that's
And
it.
that you are correct, and the signs continue to adorn our sidewalks that say HOV. The issue with arterial HOV is that there's virtually no opportunity for enforcement. And the average motorist knows that since there's nobody who can see them, there's no place to pull them over, the signs
That
have been there.
realistically,
But there has been no implementation, no enforcement of that that I'm aware of.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to have you back about once a year to sort of update where things are going as far as Ann Arbor, and transportation is always one of those things that it's like taxes you always complain about if you get caught in traffic.
Well, and with a growing city, we do see more and more people moving around in more and more means, and that my role within the city is to continue to develop systems in advance and in responsive to our needs, and hopefully there'll be even more to talk about next year.
Great. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank our viewers for joining us today, and look forward to your continued support here on Conversations. Thank you.